American history has been marked by persistent and determined efforts to expand the scope and inclusiveness of civil rights. Although equal rights for all were affirmed in the founding documents of the United States, many of the new country's inhabitants were denied essential rights. Enslaved Africans and indentured servants did not have the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that British colonists asserted to justify their Declaration of Independence. Nor were they included among the people of the United States who established the Constitution in order to promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Instead, the Constitution protected slavery by allowing the importation of enslaved persons until 1808 and providing for the return of enslaved people who had escaped to other states. During the early decades of the 20th century, movements to resist such racial and gender discrimination gained strength in many countries. While a Pan-African movement emerged in response to European imperialism, Black Americans developed various strategies to challenge racial discrimination in the United States. Educator Booker Washington emphasized economic development without openly challenging the Jim Crow system. Harvard University-educated scholar W.E.B. Du Bois became a leading advocate for civil rights and Pan-African unity among Africans and African descendants elsewhere in the world. In 1909, Du Bois and other African-American leaders joined with white proponents of racial equality to form the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. The NAACP faced competition from various groups offering alternative strategies for racial advancement. In 1941, labor leader A. Philip Randolph's threat to stage a march on Washington, D.C., prodded President Franklin D. Roosevelt to issue an executive order against employment discrimination in the wartime defense industries. The Interracial Congress of Racial Equality also undertook small-scale civil disobedience to combat segregation in northern cities. In the aftermath of World War II, Black American civil rights efforts were hampered by ideological splits. Du Bois and prominent Black American entertainer Paul Robeson were among the leftist leaders advocating mass civil rights protests while opposing the Cold War foreign and domestic policies of President Harry Truman. But Truman prevailed in the 1948 presidential election with critical backing from NAACP leaders and most Black Americans able to vote. Even as the NAACP consolidated its national dominance in the civil rights field, local Black activists acted on their own to protest racial segregation and discrimination. For example, in 1951, a student walkout at a Virginia high school led by Barbara Johns, age 16, was one of the local efforts that culminated in the Brown decision. When the Supreme Court did not set a time limit for states to desegregate their school systems and instead merely called for desegregation with all deliberate speed. In December 1955, NAACP activist Rosa Parks's impromptu refusal to give up her seat to a white man on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, sparked a sustained bus boycott that inspired mass protests elsewhere to speed the pace of civil rights reform. After boycott supporters chose Baptist minister Martin Luther King, Jr., to head the newly established Montgomery Improvement Association, King soon became the country's most influential advocate of the concepts of nonviolent resistance forged by Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Despite the bombing of King's house and other acts of intimidation by segregationists, MIA leaders were able to sustain the boycott until November 1956, when the NAACP won a Supreme Court order to desegregate the bus system. 4 Black college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sparked a new phase of the Southern Civil Rights Movement on February 1, 1960, when they staged a sit-in at a drugstore lunch counter reserved for whites. In the wake of the Greensboro sit-in, thousands of students in at least 60 communities, mostly in the Upper Obanese South, joined the sit-in campaign during the winter and spring of 1960. Despite efforts by the NAACP, SCLC, and CORE to impose some control over the sit-in movement, the student protesters formed their own group, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, to coordinate the new movement. SNCC gradually acquired a staff of full-time organizers, many of whom were former student protesters, and launched a number of local projects designed to achieve desegregation and voting rights. Each of them had led marches in the street to change the laws of the American government. Numerous leaders were stimulated by their courage. These leaders attended historically black colleges and universities during the 1930s and 1940s. Among them was Kwame Nkrumah, who later became Ghana's first prime minister. He was involved with political activism while attending Lincoln University. This helped him get a better understanding of the Black American struggle. Kwame Nkrumah formed the Pan-African American movement to unify the Black diaspora. He returned home to fight for Ghana's independence from the British. He and his party launched the Convention People's Party, leading to the country's independence in 1957. Many Black Americans were invited to Ghana's celebration of liberation. Dr. Martin Luther King was one of the attendees at this event. This was a great inspiration for oppressed people across the globe. King later returned to America with a new approach to activism. Malcolm X flew to Ghana in 1964 to meet with Nkrumah. This was one of the 11 African countries he visited. He met with the Prime Minister to discuss a plan for the entire African and African diaspora to unite, fulfilling a Pan-African vision. The purpose of this meeting is to help Blacks exercise their God-given rights to freedom. The result of Ghana's independence created a ripple effect as more African countries began to push towards self-determination for their people. Julius Nyerere became the first Prime Minister of independent Tanganyika, now renamed Tanzania. Before his nomination, Julius Nyerere had been on the front lines of the liberation struggle from colonialism. As the first Tanzanian graduate of history and economics from the University of Edinburgh, he developed a deep sense of social justice and a hunger to achieve self-determination for his people. While SNCC activists were filling jails in the American South, the Congo joined the family of nations. The year 1960 had been declared the Year of Africa by the UN. At that time, Congo's independence was particularly remarkable because its people had endured Belgian rule, which was more cruel and violent than France's colonization of Algeria and Guinea and Britain's colonization of Ghana. Shortly after the UN rebellion that protested Patrice Lumumba's murder, the young writer or activist Maya Angelou, who was also a leader of the Cultural Association for Women of African Heritage, reached out to Malcolm X. By 1961, the Harlem Mosque minister had gained an international reputation for his confrontational, unapologetic oratory, which reflected the Nation of Islam's candid discussions about the complicity of white people with racial terror, slavery, and segregation. In the North, Malcolm X was exploring how to expand the OAAU's reach from a small but devoted circle of supporters and how to best achieve the organization's goal of transnational anti-racist action. In the South, members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee sought to escalate the impact on federal legislation, which they felt was too slow in coming and too timid in its challenge of Southern segregation and economic injustice. SNCC organizers zeroed in on the worst offending Confederate states when it came to blocking the African American vote and flouting the federal bans on public segregation. In Harlem, after New Year's in 1965, Malcolm X revealed his political philosophy had evolved into a version of Black Marxism to the power of one, the time he spent during the previous year with Kwame Nkrumah and Julius Nyerere and in the emancipated spaces of Cairo and Algiers, buoyed Malcolm's belief that African Americans needed to consider socialist solutions to their problems and avoid internal divisions. Coretta Scott King spoke out against apartheid and met with Desmond Tutu. U.S. students led the divestment movement in the 1980s to pressure corporations to withdraw from apartheid South Africa. Randall Robinson's Trans-Africa Group was instrumental in pushing the U.S. Congress to impose sanctions on South Africa. When Nelson Mandela was finally released in 1990, millions of Black Americans celebrated his freedom as their own. Today, Black Americans' effort in stimulating the courage among Blacks' freedom, sovereignty, and dignity from oppression, colonization, and segregation around the world cannot be ignored. Please hit the subscribe button to join the family.